Hey look, it's a sequel to that basing video that did horrible numbers. Well, joke's on you, I'm still gonna make a bunch of episodes because I just love basing. In this episode, I'm gonna focus on bases for science fiction settings, though, like the last time, I'll go into the larger principles that you could really use in any kind of project. I've caught the Necromunda bug lately, and like everyone involved in skirmish games, I'm gonna pillage John Blanche and Anna Polansk's bodies of work. This time, I'm gonna work with actual minis so that you can see the work of integrating them into the landscape. They were kindly provided to me by a friend, and I just changed a couple things on top of his kit bashes. For the first scheme in this episode, you can see I'm starting with my trusty layer of milliput. I'm sticking the figure in there and using his feet to mark some footsteps in the sand. With the position set, I'm gonna add a couple of big tubes, these are the ones that come on brushes, sticking up from the sand, and a little techie bit or two to balance it out. The towers get a round of gribbling with watch pieces and green stuff cables, as well as random bits of junk that I had lying around. While I gribble, let's actually talk theory. Here, he's just a small guy in a vast expanse of sand. Having a couple of pieces of machinery just tower over him tells the viewer that, despite his own menacing, chaosy look, he stands beside something older and weirder than him. Originally, the model had a big flag on his back, but I didn't really like it. So by taking the height off of the silhouette of the model and switching it to be on the base itself, I can keep the verticality I like, but make this figure silhouette better. Right, on to painting this one. I'm gonna stick with something called the Zorn palette on this one. For the few who don't know, Anders Zorn was a famous Swedish painter from the end of the 19th century, and while he didn't exclusively use those colors, the big mark he left on painting is the palette named after him, composed of lead white, which is now titanium white, ochre yellow, vermilion, which is now cadmium red, and ivory black. You're seeing a few of my favorite pieces of his on screen right now. Unlike what we've been used to in miniature painting, the palette can be very warm and cheerful. But today we're interested in the style that John Blanche made popular, and we're using Zorn's colors for quite an ominous piece. I'm going to use a sort of tan mix on the jacket and the top of the towers, and blend in pure red at the bottom of everything. I paint in the skin tone and then move on to highlighting, just blending in some lighter colors, and he's pretty much ready to go. After a while of letting the oils cure and then varnishing, I do a very dark brownish wash to get definition onto the gribbles and the figure. You know the drill by now, wait for it all to set before moving on to the next step. In this case, it's actually the final step as well. Once again, I'm using the old crushed pastel technique. This time we're staying in palette with this deep dark red. I apply a lot of it all over the bottom of the figure and the base itself. I then mix a little bit of my tan pastel in there and apply it in a few spots on the ground. With a pipette loaded with isopropyl alcohol, I touch those spots and let the iso spread. It should make for a lovely bit of variation. Here I went a step further and dropped some more of the tan in a couple of spots and applied the ISO again. I really like how much of a variation in tone and finish there ended up being on this one in the end. Aside from the cure time, the whole basing took me maybe an hour, and that's including the mini. So if you want your scheme for the ash waste to not just be like a dark gray sand, well, feel free to use a bunch of different weird colors for the sand and to have it really crawl up on everything in your minis. Hey look, it's another Necromunda scheme, except this time we're sticking to the inside of the city instead of venturing out into the wastes. The first step is to grab an actual Necromunda base. They're in most of the gang kits. Just ask anyone who plays, they'll usually have a million ready to chuck at you. I clip the rim off of that base and glue it on the side of the base proper. Around that, I'm gonna throw some plastic art tubing and guitar wires. I cut a big piece of plastic art with a hole in it and then glue it over top of our build, making sure the hole overlaps the original Necromunda base. Then with some texture paste, it just doesn't matter, anyone will do, I'm gonna fill the sides of the base a little just to make it look a little less shabby. Now I'm gonna layer more plastic art over the top of what we got, just for a little extra separation between the areas of the base. The top bit is gonna be textured like a concrete coffer. I layer a mix of milliput and green stuff flat on the area that I want to texture, and then press a bunch of coffee stirrers glued as a texture plate. Just make sure that it's been lubricated properly. I know it doesn't make any sense for that kind of texture to show up on a flat floor, because that's just not how concrete is poured, but it looks cool, so whatever. On the other part, I'm gonna cover the plastic art with a mix of acrylic putty and plastic cement. I make a dabbing motion while applying to make the classic cast steel texture. After both parts are dry, I do just a light bit of sanding over the entire base. Time for greebling again. I'm gonna reuse our tubing and cables, just making sure to have like a bit of the cabling come out of the big hole we have in the middle. To finish up the greebling, I'm gonna add a couple pieces of rubble. This is a piece of leftover milliput that I flattened. I just wrap it in a kitchen towel and rubble. With such a texturally busy base, we can create a lot of interesting detail without going for a very complex paint job later. In a way, we're creating a lot of noise on the ground that a clear figure is gonna emerge from. With the mini's striding pose, it seems pretty appropriate to have him walk out from the shadows in a way. You can imagine it working like focus when filming or taking pictures. Our very busy background is a blurry texture that the subject is gonna stand out from. Our background is very busy, but by making it blurry, we make sure that the subject is really standing out from it. That separation from the subject and the background on its own can convey a bunch of different things, so feel free to adapt the technique to whatever you like, and it works the other way around too. Alright, once again the painting on this is gonna be comically easy. Over my primer I just throw some metallics in a couple of spots and then paint gray over most of everything else. But actually there is a secret final step to this one. The rain effect. I'm gonna start by filling up my little hole with UV resin and then blast it with the torch. In a couple of spots I'm gonna drop a bit more of the resin and then dip a very short thing of fishing wire in. I'm gonna take a product called Splash Gel. This one is from Green Stuff World, but I'm pretty sure I've seen it somewhere else. And then I'm gonna dip some old brush protectors in, which this episode is kind of dedicated to them, I guess. With this improvised tool, I stick it on the base, pull it out, and bam, we got a little water ring. I repeat that in a couple of different sizes, mostly in the areas that aren't overshadowed by the big guy, though you can definitely cheat by pretending there's a bit of wind. After all that's dry, I hit the top of our mini, its legs, and pretty much the entire base with a gloss varnish. Did you know that any sufficiently large space with a high humidity can actually have clouds form in them? So yeah, it can totally rain indoors in a hive city. Once again, I'm really happy with the final paint job. I think he looks very nice for just having used 4 colors and doing him in an hour. Could I have gone smoother with the blends and a little higher on the highlights? Definitely. In the end, I still think the effect is pretty cool. Alright, last model for today. A while back I asked around and people wanted me to tackle a forest undergrowth style of base. You could use this for literally any setting, but I'm making it a sort of forest planet for this little guy. He's an old soldier from a platoon of the Imperial Guard that's been forgotten by the administration on a peaceful world. It starts with stuff you've already seen before. Milliput terrain, a big pile of rocks for my guardsmen to sit on, and a few roots. You might have noticed this isn't really going to be a gaming base, but more like a little diorama. If you're vaguely familiar with painting or photography composition, you'll recognize that putting your subject smack dab in the middle isn't necessarily the most compelling look. So I'm adding a couple of snapped twigs and miniature rubble pieces on the side where the mini is gonna sit. That way I'm emphasizing the symmetry of the overall composition. Those big twigs behind where he's gonna sit are very important narratively as well. I want my guardsman to look like he's being slowly swallowed by the forest. This isn't about a predator lurking. This is about the feeling that if you stood still long enough in some places, you would just kind of melt into the world. Now, the undergrowth of the temperate forest that I'm basing this on isn't usually where greenery thrives. The floor is covered in litter from the trees above, so I use a hole punch that cuts out little leaves and go to town on a coffee filter with it. I apply some watered down PVA to the base and throw the leaves on, just arranging them as I please before it sets. You'll usually see people do this with a painted coffee filter, but we're more after the texture here, and we'll paint the floor uniformly later. Over that layer of leaf litter, I'm gluing some nice bits that my friend gave me for this little diorama, and that's actually most of the composition here. We'll be doing a little bit of filling out later after the painting is done. Once again, with painting, I wanted to show you the versatility of the Zorn palette. This is my same original 4 colors as I used for the first mini, except this time I'm going to use some very cold browns and cold greens to paint most of what you're seeing. I want to match the kind of melancholic mood that the guardsman has. Once again, you know the drill. After the oils are cured and varnished, I do some spot washes with contrast paints where I feel it needs a little extra definition. Now we can move on to the very important bit of this one. We're gonna make ferns. This is a technique that I picked up in a Baron von Clay video. The link will be down in the description, so please go watch their videos, they are very cool. It starts very simple with a mix of paint, PVA and gypsum powder. I'm not 100% sure on the ratios yet, I need to experiment more with the technique. But with the freshly made goop, I take a junk little brush and start painting the fern around a wire. After a good hour of drying, I peeled the ferns from the base I painted them on and bent them a little before drilling into the base and gluing the fronds in. It felt like the ferns looked a little unpainted, so I once again used more contrast paint on them for just a quick bit of variation and called it a day on this guy. I could probably go a little denser with him and add some moss and more details, but with the composition as it is, I think it looks pretty true to the forest I'm used to seeing. And that is a wrap on the second episode of the basing series. Hopefully there was something interesting in there for you. Once again, I would love to hear what you'd want to see from this series. There are a few ideas that are floating around in a document right now, but I'm open to suggestions. I am sick when I'm recording this, so apologies for the horrible voice. I'll see you again in the next episode where I reach the Grandmaster rank on chess.com.